April 23rd, after 1:30 in the afternoon. We're continuing our work on the education transformation bill. Yesterday we had testimony from people responding to the council passed version of the bill, and that's kind of what we have here for today, and to help us set up as we look forward tomorrow. So the big day on our committee, where we're going to be here, I think, for quite a while as we do a walkthrough of what may be our own committee bill, and with JFO in here, looking at helping us look at numbers and understand how it all works. But today we're in the phase of still taking the action and helping us set up for our own work. So I want to introduce everybody here, so we don't need to go through that formality. So just introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education. Jill Briggs Campbell, Deputy Secretary of Education.
Okay. And we've talked ahead of time, so the floor is yours.
Thank you for inviting us this afternoon. We'll share some of our initial reflections on H4 54 as passed by the House. Really want to start with areas of shared understanding and shared goals, then highlight areas of differences and where we will be focusing our analysis in order to provide more constructive and productive feedback as you entertain your revisions.
Are you working off what you just received a few minutes ago from the?
Oh, did we submit an assessment? I did not.
Oh, okay.
We can.
Senate Finance Committee.
We did. Yeah, we can share that if you would like to start there. That's helpful.
Only if it's helpful to you, or only if it's there for.
I was just going to reference it for my notes, but if
no, okay, we don't need to.
I don't know that it's necessary to share, but definitely, this is what we provided to Senate Finance last Friday. This is an initial conversation. Really, I think it is important for us to start by identifying areas of consensus. And so in principle, I think there's a lot of understanding around where we need to head and some of the key components to getting there. And then we'll highlight where there are some areas where we'll need to focus in and make some really strategic decisions, to get through the legislative session. I also want to note that we have not yet had an opportunity to dive deep into the modeling. So we'll be meeting with JFO tomorrow and are looking forward to that opportunity to really understand all the assumptions that went into the formula that's proposed. And we'll have after that time point some additional insight to share. So I think areas of consensus, the governor's proposal and the House's plan both do move the state of Vermont to an evidence-based foundation formula into the future. So it contemplates a similar future state that is based on research around high quality education and focused on equity. Both of the proposals are putting forward a student-focused and a student-based funding formula. So really understanding that the funding follows the student to make sure that students that have additional needs are benefiting from those additional resources. I think that's a really important point as we're talking about equity, and that there's consistency in understanding the need for base funding and adjustments for weights. Both of the proposals moves us to larger districts to achieve scale, increase student opportunities, and promote equity. There's also a recognition that the foundation funding formula is connected to governance and decisions around scale. It seems there's consensus also on a need for standardized education quality measures and really thinking about statewide graduation requirements and class size and other components that are going to be important to ensuring that every Vermont student has access to a well-rounded education. Both of the proposals are recognizing that we cannot take a cookie cutter approach in Vermont. There's never going to be a scenario where every school looks the same, every school has the same enrollment. That's not where we're headed. And so we need to be really thoughtful around how we're defining schools that are small by necessity, and how we're making adjustments to overall resourcing of schools to provide an array of offerings. Both the governor's plan and the House's plan contemplate a multi-year transition. And we know that that transition does need to account for current spending. So we're mitigating a fiscal cliff. The time frame is very different. And that, I think it's one of the big differences in terms of the governor's proposal and the House's plan. So as we move forward in talking about what we see as differences, we really haven't had the opportunity to dive deep into the modeling to be able to provide with precision how things are varying. But we certainly are coming to this with an evaluation based on the express goals that we identified with the governor's plan. So we have certainly questions around what are those assumptions underlying the base. So what type of efficiency considerations are built into the base, what scale we need to operate upon, how categorical aid is or isn't included in the foundation funding. So we're really trying to understand the overall spending as part of the House plan, not just what the foundation formula would cover. And so that's a lot of what our deeper analysis will look at. We also, within the governor's proposal, had a really strong focus on expanding career and technical education, expanding preschool access. I think those aren't contemplated as clearly within the House bill that we're really looking to understand. And the timeline is very different. So the proposal that you're reviewing from the House takes a 5-year ramp to move to a cost-based foundation formula, within the intent to move towards a evidence-based foundation formula sometime in the future after fiscal year 30. So there's kind of a 2-step process there. I think we just have a lot of questions around how the system can be sustained for 5 years before the transition to the first version of the foundation formula that's contemplated within the House bill. And I think it's important to note that our districts over the last 2 years and even over this most recent year have experienced tremendous cuts. And also there's been a lot of conversation at district levels around potentially closing schools. So what we are trying to avoid with an approach is we want to make sure that we're planful and thoughtful around how the state is setting a vision and a course to increase educational opportunities and equity as quickly as we can, right? So the concern is there is definitely a cost of time in terms of the fact that districts will continue to have to make more and more cuts in the interim before we move to a new funding system. And, as we all are engaged in this conversation, I think it's really important that we understand how we can actively manage and support that transition and ensuring that it has minimum disruption to teaching and learning and is providing more opportunities for students. So that there's a real urgency to providing those opportunities and also giving really clear guidelines around how to get there. The House's plan has a different approach to determining the district. So it's really utilizing the Commission on the Future of Public Education to identify districts. We had put forward a framework to really establish district lines within the implementation. And I think some of the policy objectives are just different. So what would be helpful in our working relationship with this committee is to really get concrete and explicit around what your objectives are. We came forward with some clear objectives with this proposal, wanting to expand career and technical education, increase access to pre-K, and achieve teacher pay parity, provide a consistent range of enrichment and course offerings across all schools in the state. And so those are really explicit goals that we came forward with, and we're support mental health as well. And the other adjustments we built in was that, when we talk about supporting teachers, we know that pay is one element, but it's not the overall element. A lot of what we've heard from our teachers is that they are supporting students that have higher acuity needs, and that they would benefit from having additional support from mental health professionals and behavior interventionists. So that was an explicit goal in building in the governor's proposal, was to really provide what we've continued to talk about in terms of specialized support that is a resource both for the teacher and for the student. So I think all of those things are really important to articulate because we're at a point in the session where there's different choices to be made. Those choices, I think, should be, we should be explicit about how those choices will impact our ability to achieve all of the objectives or to what extent they can.
We can just go back for a second. I got some of what you said, but you mentioned pre-K first, then you said.
Yeah, so the goals that we articulated were to increase average teacher salaries, so to achieve teacher pay parity across the state, expand pre-kindergarten access. We had within our modeling built in full day for 4-year-olds, expand college and career opportunities and starting in middle school. And so there are some staffing assumptions built in there around providing those type of course offerings. We want to increase the equity of educational opportunities for students, including in the allied arts and advanced coursework. So when we look across the state, there's a lot of variability in terms of the course catalogs that are offered and the enrichment programs that are offered by school. And so one of our explicit goals was to make sure that at elementary, middle, high school level, students would be able to benefit from world language and art and so forth. And then increase access to those specialized resources, which includes mental health support, behavior management, and other resources for the student and teachers. And then, of course, from a funding perspective, an explicit goal is transparent.
We're just having a discussion.
Yeah, sure.
About this. So would I be accurate if I said that your position with regard to everything just says that requires larger districts?
So working at scale, achieving scale is important for us to be able to equitably provide the consistent resources across the state.
Yeah. Okay.
With the foundation formula. So, right.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I think, so this is a really big shift in Vermont. And I think this is an important point, right? Our current system, districts will determine how much money they spend, and then the state has to raise those revenues, right, to fund the districts. We're moving to a system that is a foundation formula, and the foundation formula is designed to be equitable to ensure that students that have similar needs benefit from similar resources. That's not happening in our current system, but it is a big shift because you're working with a set amount of funding. And if you are a smaller district, you're not going to be able to stretch those dollars as much as if you were a larger district. So there is an impact. There's a connection between the funding and the size that is important for us to call out. And that's why we need to think about this in the context of promoting educational quality and financial viability as being important vectors to evaluate with any transition to a foundation formula. Because we're no longer in a position where you're going to see great variability in spending. It's going to have consistent spending per student, and your ability to offer programming is dependent on your scale. If there weren't questions.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And I think the other question, the conversation we've had a lot is, what's the right size, right? And I think we keep coming back to, there's no one silver bullet, right? We have to make the choices in Vermont that are going to be best suited for our schools, for our students, for our teachers. And we need to look at research and best practices to inform and shape that approach. And as we talk about district size, the research has been inclusive. There's a lot of different studies around what size is going to be most beneficial. As we've described, we're going to be operating within the bookends, right, of what research has indicated would be a good size, right? So I think that's important to consider because it's not just about district size. It's around how you're funding the system, how we're delivering education, it's all of these things in concert that are really going to ensure that we're achieving our desired outcomes.
And if I can add to that, so in sort of the plainest terms, moving to a larger district without making changes to how you deliver education or operationalize is not going to achieve high student outcomes, right? And at the same time, making just a change to the funding system without changing scales so that we can offer more and also how we deliver education is not going to lead to student outcomes. This is why we've always sort of asked folks when we came in January, we said there's a three-legged stool. And we sort of asked everyone to sit in the complexity of that, right? And understandably, within sort of a short legislative session, there's an instinct to try to pull them apart. And we understand that instinct and maybe even necessity, but we really request that we're always keeping all three legs in the discussion, because there genuinely is no silver bullet. There is no one district size that's going to magically produce great student outcomes. There is no one funding formula that's going to magically produce student outcomes. All of these things have to go together. And we really have not had an opportunity in this session, because it's been so focused on the funding and the governance, to talk about quality and the ways that we can deliver better quality within our system. There are things within kind of our proposed priorities that would help to improve quality, but there's other work to be done. So I just want to like flag that as we're having the conversation. Any one solution does not exist. We're going to have to do all three pieces if we are really, really focused on students at the dead center of what we're hoping to achieve.
So I think for, this is really our first conversation as now this bill has come to you. It would be, we thought this would be a helpful opportunity to maybe answer questions that you may have. Or also, I think what we are really hoping is really clearly articulating the objectives you have. So it sounds like you will be putting forward a committee bill tomorrow or some revisions. Helpful for us to know what are those policy objectives so that we can be a productive partner in evaluating in providing input around the extent to which those refinements are able to achieve those objectives.
Well, we haven't had, full committee discussions. It's more sense of where the committees are, and so tomorrow will be something to begin to react to and think, use as a vehicle for thinking through. But I think there's so getting the foundation formula of and recognizing that where we are now, with a whole of call it 170 a year or whatever it is, and trying to backfill that for 5 years. And that getting a different system, and also having all the reversible results that we've talked about, where the districts that need the help the most are the ones moving down their budgets because they're, all of those things. So trying to recognize the urgency of the situation.
Right.
And frankly, the bill will say we'll have one in July 1, 27 to get the foundation will get up and running. And that is the system for keeping the work on governance and governance structure going. And I think that one of the things as I think about this, we have this coming summer, fall, and then next session. And I think that I know that everyone in this committee cares a lot about quality and educational opportunities. I think we'll have to do a lot of work over that next year altogether to get all of that in place. It's more framework for now, and then thinking about how to fill in that. So, yes.
So being partners in this with AOE, I'm thinking beyond the bill since we get it out. Is what do you see as AOE's role in implementing the plan, and ensuring the quality is there? We keep talking about quality, but you also mentioned that you gotta make sure that once we establish a standard, who's going to be a standard bearer, and who's going to make sure that do you see that as your role as AOE?
So what we're describing is truly transformative change to our education system. I think it's imperative that the Agency of Education has a strong leadership role of that we're working with our districts in partnership to support this transition. So as part of the proposal, we requested $4 million to enhance the agency's capacity to support with the transition. we heard really clearly from our partners in the field that in previous years, they felt like they didn't have as much support from the agency in implementing major legislation. And so we have made a commitment that we need to be there in supporting that work. As we've outlined the transformation activities, we've bucketed it to 3 categories. And so one category is focused really more operationally in budget and thinking around how we can support with strategic budgeting, understanding that's aligned to the goals as we're making this transition and providing that operational support. Another bucket is focused on academics and supporting, really trying to minimize disruption during this time to teaching and learning and being able to elevate educational opportunities with more on the ground coaching and support with school improvement planning and academics. And the third area is supporting with the transitions with boards. So there's the closeout activities for the existing boards, and then there's ramping up training for the new boards that would take over, and the importance of being able to do knowledge sharing across the existing districts and the new boards to make sure that they understand the community context. So we've really organized the transformation in those 3 categories. And we've also requested 5 permanent positions as part of that, which we see as being integral, not just for the transformation activities, but into the future. The increasing the agency's capacity to support district quality, education quality, and also board support.
Just
And-
follow up.
Sure, yeah.
So, being committee, we do policy. So,
Yeah.
One of the couple of things I thought about, we've looked at, talked about is, the role of the State Board of Education, AOE. Do you see that as being, the policy ends up being Title 16? Do you see us redefining the role of AOE? And if so, do you provide inputs into that so we can do it?
So we did put forward some recommended roles and responsibilities. The way we've looked at that is that the Agency of Education and the State Board of Education both are situated within the executive branch and bring different resources and expertise. And I think it's really important that we're thoughtful around how we think about those roles in terms of shared responsibility. And so we did put forward recommendations and would see that both entities are continuing to be very much aligned, but they different strengths and different capacity to be able to inform and support the transformation. So we did put that forward. I know there's some different recommendations within the House bill, and we can come back with some additional feedback around that.
And I think also one thing that the agency is well underway is district quality standards, which you've received testimony on before, right? And so this was the Agency of Education's first opportunity to do rulemaking. And we looked at high leverage business operations, data, school safety and security, and school board governance. Really worked with partners in the field to develop those. And then within those is a subset of the overall education quality standards. I kind of call them super standards because it helps me to differentiate.
Mhm.
Those will be measured on an annual basis in ways I think that the agency has been challenged in the past to have a clear framework for accountability. So we would anticipate that that would also help to drive our support for the field in really targeted areas that we know have a real impact on both their operational viability and student outcomes, right? And how we're supporting students in through specific activities, right? It's hard to measure everything. So we're really trying to look at what do we know through evidence and research are high leverage activities that support students. Yeah,
So
and then
have you-
also ensuring operational viability.
So it's, you spread everything out, look at all the things that have to be done in the next 3 to 5 years. That's a pretty heavy lift.
Yes.
If everybody knows what their role is.
Yeah.
And that's established. And then you gotta have an evaluation process to make
Yeah.
sure who's gonna be the arbiter of the standard. That's my
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I mean, and part of it, if we go just all the way back to kind of statute, who is the responsible entity for all Vermont students? It's the Agency of Education.
Sure.
Like that's very clear from a federal standpoint in, kind of state law. That is ultimately kind of where the ultimate responsibility for students' education lies.
Yeah.
And this accountability, right?
Yeah, it's very clear in statute, right? And it's the Agency of Education's responsibility to ensure substantially equal education for every student in Vermont. And the Agency of Education is also responsible for implementing federal and state education law with fidelity.
Thanks.
You used the sort of, you said high level levers to best achieve student outcomes. What does that, things like that?
I'll let you go into the specifics, but I think what I would say just as an overarching framing is we're being very intentional on creating alignment with our accountability tools. So I think in the past, the agencies allowed different processes to support schools and to support continuous improvement and planning. And we are looking to bring all of those together into a comprehensive tool so that there is consistency. There's also alignment across divisions in the agency of being able to support district quality, education quality, special education monitoring, right? All as one overarching support function to the field. And an intentional step towards that is aligning accountability tools. So instead of having a tool that's looking just at district quality and another tool that's looking at education quality, we are being intentional around connecting the dots because we know that they're all connected. We know that having conditions in the school of success are important to actual quality opportunities, and we can't divorce the two. And so over our approach is creating that continuity with how we're developing our tools, reporting and support in the field so that we are really achieving the overarching objectives. And I think it's shared in Vermont that it's when we talk about education, we also need to talk about the conditions of success and some of the other support functions that are provided in schools. And so we really are taking a holistic approach as an agency as we're evaluating and supporting that implementation.
Yeah, and I think it's also really important to clarify because I think there's sometimes a misunderstanding. When we're talking about student outcomes, we've always taken a whole child approach to that. We've been really clear about that in our state profile report. So assessment scores are one measure, but we also have looked at chronic absenteeism. We've looked at graduation rates. We've looked at, when we did the listen and learn, we talked to educators about mental health and behavioral supports and like the behavioral incidences that they are experiencing and trying to address. So looking holistically, what are the high leverage kind of activities? So we know that the best predictor of student outcomes is a highly qualified and effective teacher. Right. And so that is, I think, a driver. We've already seen that in Vermont in the way that we're trying to improve that. We're talking about doing numeracy, kind of math initiatives, science, we know is another area that we're struggling. So how do we support our teachers in becoming most effective in doing the thing that they want to do the most, which is the learning and teaching and collaboration? And what are some of the things that we can take off of their plate that they have said are duplicative and burdensome and take them away from the classroom? Things like continuous improvement plans, when implemented effectively, those become your strategic plan. And strategic plans drive budgeting choices, right? So it all really lines up when you start to look at some of our specific standards. We don't have statewide graduation requirements. We've kind of shared that we have a huge range in graduation requirements. 6 to 120 or 6 to 130 graduation requirements between districts. So think about from a student perspective, what it would be like in high school to switch from district to district. And how what you may have done on a path towards graduation in one district is no longer going to put you on. I mean, there's a fairness aspect to that. But from the agency, it also becomes really hard for us to identify which districts are successful because it's not apples to apples. So that's another high leverage standard that we might look at.
So when you talk about graduation requirements, or uniform graduation requirements, my sort of immediate reaction always is too prescriptive, getting too prescriptive, or being in fear of getting too prescriptive. But think you're talking about something different than that. And I
Yeah.
think you're talking about, if I'm right, you're talking about proficiencies. Or you can describe what you're talking about, because I just have this instinctive reaction of not wanting it to be too prescriptive and top down and telling
Right.
schools what to do. So
And-
elaborate a little bit on what you're actually.
And that's always a challenge. We want to achieve that right balance so that we can have the appropriate structure to ensure that our students are getting equitable opportunity while allowing for the flexibility at that local level. So as an example, I've just this week met with a number of teachers who teach financial literacy and personal finance. Some districts have that as a graduation requirement, others don't. And what's interesting is even if you have that as one graduation requirement for the state, there are different ways that you can teach that. You can teach that within your math course, right? You can teach that within a business course, right? So there's flexibility with how the content is delivered, but the essential component is making sure that those students are graduating with an understanding of personal finance. And so the state can be prescriptive in identifying these are the content areas that you need to teach. And here's the flexibility with which how you can deliver that instruction within your school. That's just one example.
And then also with proficiencies and skills. So it's a shared understanding. And actually, this work has been, I think, ongoing and it's not starting from scratch. There's actually been quite a lot of work around this, around standards and proficiency standards for quite a long time. So it would be bringing it together. And there seems to be a shared a general consensus that this would be helpful, because I do think when you look from the perspective of students, there's just a real fairness problem there, right? And so what do we collectively believe that each of our graduates should know and know how to do by the time they walk out the door, so that we know that they're well prepared, right? One of the other measures that we look at is like persistence rates after graduation. They're not great in Vermont. And that's a concern to me as someone who taught higher education. What that's saying to me is that we're not necessarily preparing our students well for the demands and rigors of college or maybe the workforce.
Can you explain persistent rate?
Staying in
Yeah.
secondary.
Yeah.
So they graduate high school, enroll for an associate's or a bachelor's, but are they completing the program?
How do you measure that? Are you able to keep track of it? Are you able to track that?
Yeah.
Yes, we are. So we use National Clearinghouse data. We're able to track that. There's a lagging indicator, but we are able to review that.
So
And it's part of our ability framework.
and so you're saying that on that measure, we're not necessarily doing that well?
Right.
And you also mentioned like one of the indicators being absenteeism and other things. Can you how are we doing on those?
Yeah.
Some of those other metrics that could.
Chronic absenteeism is a national, I don't like using the word crisis, but I would say we're rising to the level of crisis, right? So we know that, it's really, really critical that kids are in school so that they can learn. And we saw in COVID nationally a real spike in absenteeism rates, understandable, but they have really not come back down. So we've been doing work around this, and it's very like interdisciplinary work. So we work at the Agency of Education with community partners in the field. We're working with UVM, we're working with the American Academy of Pediatrics, Agency of Human Services, Department of Mental Health, big effort here and a multi-year effort to understand what are the kind of critical factors that lead to students not attending school. We know from the data, and we actually can share this with you, we've got this data, that our economically disadvantaged students have much higher rates of chronic absenteeism. So this is 10 or more school days per year that they're missing. We know that our students on IEPs have higher rates of chronic absenteeism. And then I think, not surprisingly, our foster and unhoused students also have the highest rates. So what are all the contributing factors? And we know that there's things like transportation and family issues and health issues. Mental health has now become a really persistent factor in chronic absenteeism, students experiencing anxiety. This is actually why we're working closely with the pediatric community because they have a role in this, right? When a student is brought to them by their parents experiencing anxiety, are they sort of writing them that note, or are they sort of reaching back out to the school and saying, I think we have an issue here that we need to address? We also know, though, that there's a disengagement issue here, right? And that students need to see the value of coming to school. And so that's also part of how do we offer students meaningful, impactful school experiences? What is our vision for education in ways that would keep kids to overcome maybe those barriers, right? To find that path through some of those barriers because they feel like it's worthwhile to them. So there's a national issue that we're all kind of dealing with. In Vermont, this has been a really persistent problem for us. And there's significant work to do. But I think that in addition to those wraparound services and understanding some of those root causes, there is also a root cause of just engagement, right? What do I get from school? And we know that this generation of students has a different relationship with school than previous generations, right? That kind of promise of school feels like it's been broken a little bit for them. And so how do we make this meaningful?
How do we?
We have ideas.
So I think a couple of areas. When we're looking at graduation rates, we actually see much higher graduation rates for our students that are in our career and technical education cohort. I think it just shows purposeful. They're really making connections to how their education is aligning to their future. There's high engagement levels. We also see a lot of success with many of our community schools and being able to connect different resources in the school. So we were just at Winooski last week and meeting with the dental hygienist, and really, a part of that of having it on campus is so that they're not missing school time. And all of those are important factors you're thinking about levels of engagement. We look at, electives and enrichment programs being an incentive for students to come to school because it's something that is really interesting to them and sparks their learning in different ways. And so that's why we think about a well-rounded education, making sure that students have an array of courses to offer, to select from. We know after school can be a big incentive as well. And there's different enrichment opportunities in the extended day that can be provided. And so as we approach this work and we're really thinking about the funding, that's why we always talk about the assumptions. When you're looking at the funding model, what are the assumptions built in? What can we deliver with that amount of funding for our students? And how do we make sure that that's aligned to a vision of the educational Vermont experience that we want for our children?
I think we also have some pretty clear indicators in past legislation that Vermont would like to see an education system that really values personalized learning. We've been meeting with students since actually back in November as part of the Listen and Learn, but we've actually been, we have a student advisory group that we've been meeting with, and they articulate this really clearly. Students are super practical about what they want, right? And they really want opportunities to kind of find their jam, as I like to say, right? And we actually have some of this in statute. Personalized learning plans, flexible pathways, career and tech ed. Like, we've built this in. How do we actually implement this with fidelity so that every student gets those opportunities, which we know is not the current condition? And that may be, when we talk about a world-class education in Vermont, this is like the thing that gets us, like Zoe and I, like twinkly-eyed, right? Like, this is why we keep getting up every morning, is because we have an opportunity to do something in Vermont that's really special here. When we talk about a world-class education in a small rural state, we could do something really special. And that's, kind of why we keep going with our coffee, purpose, and optimism.
One educator put it to me was that if a student finds something about which they're passionate, everything else follows.
That's right.
Yeah.
Because you can persist through the things you don't like if you know
Yeah,
what
the kids that are, you can put it as the kids that are engaged in extracurriculars, almost by definition, and that are in school and everything else as well. So Senator Williams, even this.
So I was told this morning that in our district, there were 100 students that were denied access to Stafford Tech, CTE, because, well, it appeared that the district didn't want to give up the money. And I don't know, that's anecdotal. because I haven't checked into it, but do you think that CTE might be a part of the solution? Because we got 2 to 3 years for this to roll out. Maybe juniors and seniors, we may end up losing some of that in the interim.
I think this is where scale is also important for the conversation, right? And so I think what you're articulating is competition for funding, right? And so what we want to be able to design in Vermont is an opportunity for high school students to take advantage of current technical education, to take advantage of accelerated course offerings, AP and others, right? And it's challenging to do that on limited budgets. You have a small enrollment, right? And so I think as we're contemplating a future state, I think there's really a shared desire to allow students to explore multiple pathways. We want that personalization. We want them to take advantage of all these opportunities. It sometimes is possible for a high school to do that if they're not operating at scale. And so it goes back to that question. We don't want to be too big. We don't want to be too small. It's getting to that sweet spot. But as it relates specifically to career and technical education, our team's been involved over the last 2 years of studying career and technical education and making recommendations for governance and funding reform. And as we landed on that recommendation, it was around creating really shared responsibility and shared funding, because the sending school has certain responsibilities and support that they must offer their student that ultimately graduates with them. And it's important that those sending schools are funded appropriately for those services. So some of those dollars stay at that sending school, and then making sure that the dollars that are going to the tech center are sufficient to provide really the high tech world class experiences at career tech. And so we did put forward a recommendation recognizing that historically there has been competition. And as we reviewed that and did working groups with different CTE directors and other educators, it was clear that there's shared responsibility. And so we need to be really thoughtful around how we fund that. And we proposed a model that we think helps to capture those costs that the sending school still would be responsible for and need to be funded, and those costs that would be needed at the tech center to support those programs.
And then in defense of Stafford, I know they had so many seats, but there are other CTE centers that could have taken those students who were within a reasonable community.
So we also looked at governance with CTE as well, because we know that that's an issue, right? So we have 17 different CTEs, and some of them are independent districts, and some of them are co-located, and some of them are not, and some of them are independent schools. So we have, per usual, a lot of variety and a lot of variability. The cost to operate programs, how much they are paying highly qualified CTE instructors, different budgeting practices. So again, we try to address the entire system. So and also one single governance unit with really generous funding for CTE to eliminate that competition.
Right. And so the recommendation, just to go a step further, is also creating that early exposure in middle school and assuming that there would be certain staffing available at the central office of the district, of the sending district, to be that liaison to the CTE structure. And then really making sure we're aligning those programs to the workforce needs. So in that example, if there's a wait list for a certain program, that may mean that it's really in demand and it would be valuable for a program to be offered at an adjacent tech center. And so part of the approach is really to look holistically at the state to identify where programming is needed and make sure that we are offering a sufficient number of spots for those programs that are in high demand. And those programs that may be under-enrolled and may not be as connected to high wage, high demand jobs, maybe we need to think about sunsetting those, right? And really focusing on other programs that are going to have a bigger impact for students. So that is part of the proposal brought forward. And I think an area that we'll need to have further conversation. The House bill does not focus on expanding career and technical education, at least in the funding model. And I think that's an area that we need to understand what that looks like in the future.
Thank you. I didn't look it up.
This is actually this is exactly what we were hoping to understand. What are the key areas of priority and focus as we're doing our evaluation? And, we kind of offered a rubric before. We've been really clear about what our priorities are and understanding. I think we have some shared
Right.
priorities there. And then how does that, and you probably heard me say it before, budgets are an expression of priorities. And so as you're making decisions in this building, how are you expressing those priorities? And we'll help to support that evaluation.
Yes.
We're gonna take you back about a half hour. So we were talking about, you needed 4 million for transition for fiscal year 26.
Please.
Out of this committee, I'm not sure you got 4 million.
We-
So I'm sure you're having a conversation with appropriations.
Yeah.
I think the
Right.
intention, from what I understand, and we are having further conversations, but I think the intention was to actually have recurring funds
Yeah.
year over year to support the permanent position. So we certainly appreciate that. But there's also a need for additional resources for us to actually support with this transformation and transition. We have discussed at length that the agency has been under-resourced for years, and this is a massive change that we need to make sure we are resourced to support. And some of those costs are more one time. So in addition to the permanent positions, there's resources we need to kind of build up some of our data systems, build up our tools, develop some of our dashboards, really to be able to provide very meaningful, high impact resources to the field. And so once those are developed, we would expect those to be kind of assumed and managed by our existing team. But what we've done in that request is really itemize those activities that we currently are not resourced to do with staffing, and also would be one-time capacity building efforts to support.
And I think also it's really important for folks to know, and well, obviously, again, we'll have this conversation with appropriations as well. But the areas that we identified were very clearly articulated as needs in the field through the policy sprint teams. So when we brought folks from the field in, most of whom were concerned about the timeline, right, and the transition, they were really clear and specific in what they would need to be successful. And that is reflected in our budget request. And they were very clear and specific that it was the state that needed to provide it. So we are feeling some real urgency to ensure that we are well positioned to provide that support, because as Zoe has said, but I think as you've also heard from when you have stakeholders from the field in this room, we need to make sure that this transition is as I don't know if we're ever going to hit seamless, but it is as effective as possible, and with the least disruption to student learning. So it's really important that we resource this well. If we underfund this and under-resource this, it's going to cause a lot of pain in the field, and we really are concerned about that. And so if you can help us to articulate that, Senator, that would be great.
So have you developed budget request for transition for the out years? Beyond like 27, 28.
Yeah, we would love.
Yeah.
We've actually thought about, I know your budget cycle is on an annual basis, but we have thought this out in a 5-year timeline to align with the overall transformation, to understand the totality of what we expect would need to be supported. Some of that we need to come back and refine after doing phase 1 of the evaluation. So we've talked a lot about system integration and curriculum alignment. A first phase of that work is really doing a diagnosis of where we are now, and then building in a plan for how to get there into the future and understand what type of support would be needed. But we do have placeholders as we're thinking about what that long-term transition would be.
Good. And different question.
Yes.
So you guys did a good job of listen and learn as you built up to developing this program. And I know you're well aware that communication of any transformation, communication aspect to, the administration, I'm talking about school education administration, not governor's administration, parents, students, school boards, et cetera, is critical. I'm just kind of wondering what you anticipate in June and July and August as you build up to, you'll have a piece of legislation, may not be perfect, but it'll have guideposts. What are you going to do then? Like, how are you going to bring people on board that this effort is, worthy and it's got the right goals and the right tools to launch?
How are we going to bring it on board? Like, I think this is a collective effort. So I do want
Very
to
good.
say that. Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
All right.
I just want you to articulate what you need for support or what.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a softball question, but it's enormous. We'll fail if we don't communicate well.
Couple things. So we started today's presentation by highlighting the areas of consensus. Not an accident that there's consensus.
Yeah.
Because what we put forward in the governor's proposal was really in response to what we heard from the Listen and Learn tour. And I think is consistent with what we're continuing to hear in the conversation in terms of the priorities for Vermonters and where the support is most needed. So I think we're starting from a place of shared understanding of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So I think we need to start there. I also think we need to be clear about building in short evaluation cycles. This work is very comprehensive, and it's important that we're really clear-eyed in evaluating the progress of implementation and identifying key points where we may need to make mid-course corrections in order to achieve our intended outcomes and also mitigate any unintended outcomes through this process. We will be, very much closely connected to the field. So I'll give an example of, recent legislation and how we've done this work. With Act 139 that was passed, that was about the time I came on board. That was going to discuss major change in terms of how we teach literacy and promote reading skills across the state. And the first question was, how are we going to resource this, right? So the agency put together a companion initiative called Read Vermont to really make sure that we're being intentional on supporting that. And we did that by building an approach that responded to the needs of the field. We heard that we need to make sure we're providing job-embedded coaches, that we're providing professional learning communities. And so we designed our approach and our support based on those needs. We would do the same with this. So we already know what the objectives are. We've done the policy sprint team, so we know about where the questions and concerns are with the transition, and we will develop our support to really zero in on those areas and make sure that we're aligning our focus in areas that are going to be the greatest need to support and mitigate, I think a lot of the challenges with this type of change.
But I do think that we also, this has been, as the secretary said, these were not new ideas, right? I think that there was coming forward with a big comprehensive package was new, saying soup to nuts, let's do it all, right? And I think, if we're being honest, that took folks by surprise, right? That the administration came forward with that big of a plan. But I do think that none of those ideas came out of nowhere, right? Not only did they come from the Listen and Learn, but as I like to remind my colleagues in the field, that in every conversation that I have had with most of them for the past 5 years, they've identified the same issues over and over and over again. And as Secretary Saunders would say in conversations, if it's been identified as an issue, we're going to try to fix it, right? And I do actually think that if we look at where we are, there is actually very strong consensus on the major points. And right now we're really focused on where the differences are because we're trying to nail down and improve and really come up with a product at the end. But I think once we're out of session, maybe a moment to sort of pause and say, we actually did have consensus from the start. I think the reason that we've been able to do anything this quickly is because there was a general understanding that we had a highly complex system, that it was more expensive than maybe Vermonters could afford. And that it wasn't yielding the results for every student that we really, really wanted. That's, I think, what we actually did have a really shared understanding of when we all walked in January. And I think coming back to that and doing so, that's why I, was sort of poking at you, but like, this is a we. And we collectively, including folks in the field, have really been identifying these obstacles and barriers to success over time. So how do we then, I think so,
also the
so many
district-
times I think of these as like, these are mechanical problems to be overcome, right? It's a series of like, you solve a problem and you solve another problem and you solve another problem, but there is a vision that needs to be expressed, right? And this was never about just cutting costs. If we were cutting costs, we would have done this a totally different way. We actually did this the really hard way, the really complicated way, because it was always about achieving that world-class system. So I think we need to articulate what that looks like. What does a world-class system actually look like, and what are we hoping to achieve? And so it's not as much about the loss, and it's more about the opportunity. There's work to be done. I totally agree.
I think the only thing I would add to that is what our districts have expressed is often they feel like they're going at it alone in dealing with these challenges. So while these challenges are not new, we're now coming in with a statewide vision for how we can support that, and we can build upon lessons learned in the field of really how to navigate these challenging times and result in positive opportunities for our students. So we will definitely have a very clear and explicit roadmap for the implementation plan, and there will be opportunities that we will intentionally create for feedback in the field. And that's been part of our practice as we've moved forward with this work, and that feedback will be really critical to making sure that we can deliver on the objectives.
It's definitely a we. That was,
I
if
was
you,
teasing.
you recognize,
Yeah.
we absorb an enormous amount of anxiety from our constituents, from our superintendents, et cetera, parents, students. Not dodging that. I just want to hear you guys articulate your vision on what happens starting in June. Thank you.
And how we respond is important to them and the process too.
Yeah.
So the more you can keep us on track.
Yeah, and I would hope this continues to be a partnership. So as as we're moving forward and you're hearing questions or concerns, I mean, making sure that we're having that open line of communication, because I think we are all in this to achieve these shared goals. And this is really complex work that we're fully committed to supporting to strengthen our system. This is about strengthening our public education system, promoting educational opportunities and equity for students. And we're all really committed to that.
You have a hotline?
Hoping to find us. That is never an issue.
Yeah, I think along those lines, next year is going to be at least as important as this year.
Yeah.
Yes.
As we spend the summer and fall preparing
Yeah.
and really thinking through and filling in those gaps and getting to some of those things that are a little bit more aspirational, and then trying to figure out how to operationalize those within this context. So it's also as important. The other thing is I feel excited about it. I think there's a major opportunity going through the summer and fall into next year
Absolutely.
to really bring this whole thing together in a way that we can't do in 1 year,
Right.
but we can get part of it in place in that.
This,
Yeah.
yes, this is generational change that we're describing, that is multi-year. And I think we will need to be very clear in the vision, making sure we continue to go back to what we're trying to achieve and very tactical in the moment around how we're going to deliver on these key milestones. And so we're happy to continue to come back and talk more about how we envision that transformation plan and getting more concrete around those project milestones, because I think that'll be really critical. That next year is important for readying the system, and the work needs to be sustained beyond that.
Thank you. Thanks. If you're coming, why don't we take should we leave us kind of on, but sound off just for 5 minutes, and then we have to.
We're back.
Okay, we're live. Okay. Senate Education Committee, April 23rd. We're back after a short break. It's about 2:45, and we're continuing our work in the Education Transformation. Education Transformation work. And we have with us now
Julia Richter, North Fiscal Office.
and I think as we talked about this to kind of give us a grounding on how the foundation formula actually works.
Yeah. So, I'm just joining the Zoom now. There is a slide deck on the computer page under my name.
Yeah.
And you've got it in front of you. Awesome.
Copies.
And would you like me to also go ahead and share my screen?
Yeah, I think just for other people
Okay.
watching.
So. Up here. Okay. So I'm Julie Richter, JFO. To the chair's point, I was asked to come in and do some sort of level setting, as well as demographic analysis, talking about, and specifically talking about pupil weights in Vermont, and the student count within the context of a foundation formula. So, seems. Okay, looks like one of our nonpartisan slide for some reason is not showing up, but I'm still nonpartisan. I'm still unbiased.
You're partisan.
But anyways, outline, we'll talk about pupil demographics across the state, and then components of a foundation formula. And then specifically, I'm touching on pupil weights under current law and then pupil weights in a foundation formula. How do they work?
You don't.
Oh, you've got it on your slide deck. So in case you need a reminder about the role of the office. But anyways, and then pupil weights in a foundation formula. So starting out sort of level setting and thinking about pupil demographics across the state. Did this by VSBA regions. So these are the same regions that we've looked at several times in this committee. These are those 11 regions dividing the state from the Vermont School Boards Association. Generally organized around counties. And what I've done is I've looked at the student count within these regions and then also the demographics within the regions. So when we're talking about student count, we're talking about long-term average daily membership. This is essentially how we count students in a school or school district. This is also what's included in the foundation formula, the way of counting kids. Basically what it means is it's on average the number of kids in a district over 2 years. In fiscal year 25, this number is around 83,400. And we know that the count of students in Vermont has been declining over time. Interestingly, I was looking at my data, and which goes back to 2009, and you see generally a pretty steady decline in 2009.
Yeah, it's declined from, to remember, is it like, so as high as 120 years
I
ago?
don't know. I've reached out to the AOE. I'm curious, but I don't know.
Okay.
Let me reload this slide deck. Been having some computer issues.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Let's see if this works now. Now you can see we're nonpartisan. Okay, cool. So across these regions, the total long-term average daily membership. So this is looking at the number of kids across these regions. So this first column here is showing by region the number of students in fiscal year 25. So fiscal year 25, that's the 24-25 school year. And then the next column is showing what percentage of the state's students are in that region, right? So Addison has about 4,000 students in the 24-25 school year, which represents 5% of the state's pupil count. We see that Central Vermont within these regions has the highest share of student counts. Going back to the presentation that I gave, I think last week, we know that the way that district boundaries are drawn really impacts the share that we see within each of those regions, right? So for this presentation, I'm focusing only on VSBA so that we have apples to apples.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? I know I think a week or two ago, we got a rundown of what a hypothetical situation would look like for several different maps. And one of them was based off of these regions, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's all. Just wanted to.
Yeah, when I was in here last week, first we looked at current law, then we looked at these regions, then we looked at the Bongart's map, then we looked at the administration's map.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these regions are actually they're actually not directly related to the educational delivery system, right? They're just how the SBA organizes itself for.
Exactly.
So they're they're just a proxy or something to work with. Yeah.
Total proxy,
Yeah.
because we don't have district boundaries right now, and it helps divvy up the state. One of the challenges is people often ask me, well, can you model by county? We have some school districts that span multiple counties. So then the question is, which county do you put a school district in that's part of multiple counties? So this makes those decisions for me.
Yeah.
So this next slide is showing your count of students from different grades across these regions. Of course, the K through 5 that's the widest cohort, but that's also the widest range grade. So that makes sense intuitively. It's hard to process a lot of numbers. So the next slide is showing you percentages. So this is showing across these regions within each grade cohort, what percentage does each region have of that grade? So for instance, you see that in Addison has 6% of the pre-K, the state's pre-K population, 5% of the state's K through 5 population, and so on. So each of these columns are summing to 100% because we're only looking at that group of grades.
Can I just level set? We no longer have any phantom students or counting of, we smooth out the ADM, but we don't have any counting that adds in students that don't exist.
Correct. The phantom students, which are a relic from several years ago, they are no longer included here.
Yeah.
But to your point, what you are saying is true. It is a 2-year average.
Right. Okay. 2-year average. That's where we are. Okay. Which makes sense.
So I think that this is really interesting to look at because it shows how in certain districts you can see distribution of how much how much a region had within each one of these groups, right? So Bennington has the widest distribution where it has 5% of the state's pre-K population, while it has 8% of the state's secondary population. Meanwhile, you have others like Wyndham that is an even 6% across all cohorts.
So Bennington would suggest a declining student population.
Perhaps it could also suggest there could also be other factors impacting that, right? If for some reason families with older children choose to live in Bennington,
Or they go to VBA.
That's like. Yeah, okay, thank you.
These are all weighting categories. We'll talk about what that means in a minute. But another weighting category is students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And this is a similar table that we're looking at here, but we are looking at the share of the count and the share of students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So this first table that we see here is within the region. What is the count of students that are identified from an economically disadvantaged background? And then within that region, what percentage of their students are considered from an economically disadvantaged background? So for instance, in Addison, we see that there's about 1,220 students identified from economically disadvantaged background, which represents 30% of Addison's student body. This table to the right, this final column, this is saying what share of the total students from an economically disadvantaged background in the state are in a certain region. So Addison, for instance, while 30% of their student body is economically disadvantaged background, that corresponds with 3% of the state's students from an economically disadvantaged background.
So would these be the poverty weights?
Correct.
Okay, yes, so
Yeah, can you just take a moment to remind us what qualifies a student to be from an economic?
Yeah, I don't, let me.
Is it pre-registered language?
So it used to be, I'm pulling up because I don't want to, pulling up the language specifically. It used to be, or I won't talk about what it used to be. Starting with Act 127, there was the expansion of identifying students from an economically disadvantaged background, which was students qualifying for free and reduced lunch, or students that have declared, their families have declared on a universal income declaration form, the income of that family. We have seen a pretty large expansion of identified students from an economically disadvantaged background over the last year or so, which corresponds with the Medicaid Direct Certification Program, which allows Medicaid data to be used to automatically enroll students in free and reduced price lunch.
But is it, can you help us with the threshold, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Two times,
It-
200 times, or 200 times federal poverty index?
Yeah, it's
Something.
of 185% at or below.
Of poverty level.
Yeah.
Which is low. Family of four, that's about $60,000.
Okay. So then this is my last slide of the student demographic analysis. This is looking at our English learning students. So same way to read the table, but we're looking at here, are the English learning students. So again, you see that there's 40 students within Addison qualifying as English learning. That represents 1% of that region's student body, and that corresponds with 2% of the statewide total EL students. So really what, I mean, these tables are showing a lot of information, but one of the pieces that they're showing is that there is variance across regions of student body, right? Both within a region and then across the state.
yeah, I would have expected, it's just interesting, I would have expected it to be higher. That number to be higher. Since we know what it is.
Who'd you expect? Would you expect to be higher?
I expected that 1,873 to be higher. But that doesn't mean that's with no basis of why it was somehow assumed.
Were you here? Was it Tammy Colby who told us about the different levels of ELL?
It wasn't here for the testimony, but are you talking about the tiered EL weights in the H454s passed by the House?
I can't remember if they were in there.
Yeah.
They are in there, so 1 through 6.
Yes, and so H 454 has, as passed by the House, has tiered English learner weights,
Mhm,
which are based on proficiency level,
mhm.
right? So the highest weight, and we'll talk about what this means, but essentially the lower the proficiency level, the more need the student has, the higher the corresponding dollar amount. H 454 has those they're called tiered weights,
Mhm.
right, based on proficiency level. There's also an additional weight, that is SLIFE and newcomer,
Yeah,
that could be added on to a proficiency level weight.
so that exists as well.
In H
In
454 is passed by the House, yes.
Okay. I just want to say I feel strongly about that one because for a lot of people, it's their parents who don't, or their caregiver who doesn't speak English, and they are needed in the interactions they have with the school. So Winooski, for example, has to hire a couple people who speak that language so their parents can participate in their students' education.
Yes, can I ask, not to put anybody on the spot? The Western tended English as a second language is fortunately much significantly higher than the rest of the state. What's happened?
Um,
Do a little background.
Yeah, that's traditionally where most refugee resettlement has happened. To be resettled, you had to prove that there were jobs there. So for Winooski, it was like Twin Craft soap. I mean, you had to prove there were hundreds of jobs, Rhino Foods. So Burlington and Winooski is where most people were resettled and found multifamily housing.
That's all. Thanks.
Okay, moving on. So that was the demographic analysis. So that's sort of like laying the groundwork of when we're talking about pupil weights. Those are the counts that we're talking about. So under current law, we have pupil weights. Under current law financing formula, I'm not going into too much detail because I know that we're not talking so much about current law, but I think it's helpful to level set. When we talk about pupil weights right now, we're talking about these statutory pupil weights that are used to adjust student counts based on certain needs or circumstances. So all of that demographic analysis we were just looking at. And essentially what happens is you take the number of students in a district, and you take the number of students that qualify for certain weights, and you apply that weight to increase the student count of the district corresponding with the weights that are involved. It's called the weighted long-term membership, but really just the weighted pupil count. And this is an important nuance here that these weights are used to determine district taxing capacity under current law. They're not used to calculate the amount of funding the school district receives. So these are
And you said for clarity.
yeah, sure. So under current law, the pupil weights are used to determine taxing capacity. They are not used to determine the amount of funding that a school district receives. So essentially what that means is they are baked in, they're used in the property tax rate formula to adjust what the homestead property tax rate is. So they're corresponding with the calculation of tax rates rather than the amount of funding that a district receives, right? Because in current law, the state is not saying District A, you have X number of EL students, here's your money. District B, you have Y number of EL students, here's your money. They're saying districts, build your budgets, get them approved by voters, and then we will calculate the proportional tax rate corresponding with the education spending in your budget
So there's
per
no
weighted
way-
pupil.
Feedback loop that said, okay, you got 10% of the state's English language learners. There was no recognition of
So under
the need for additional.
under current law, that need for additional resources is captured in pupil weights, but it's captured in the tax rate calculation. So essentially what that means is a district that, all else equal, a district that has more weighted pupils is going to be able to spend more for the same tax rate than a district that has fewer weighted pupils.
So it backs into allocation by making it easier to raise the money to account for those extra costs. at least in theory.
In theory.
Yeah.
And when you say current law, I'm trying to remember, did this predate the weighting changes we made 2 years ago?
Yeah, so Act 127, which was passed in 2022, updated and changed the pupil weights.
Mhm.
There were pupil weights that existed in the funding scheme before. What Act 127 did is it looked at analysis that was published by Colby. There was a pupil weighting task force.
Mhm.
And then the General Assembly passed the bill to change some of the weighting categories and update some of the weighting
Mhm.
categories.
And there was a big political debate over tax capacity versus like a block grant.
Cost equity type.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think we landed in the wrong place honestly at that time. But the argument at the time, not dissimilar, I guess, from the one we'd be making now, is just that otherwise it felt like the communities that were welcoming the most English language learners or had the most kids in poverty were the ones financially responsible for carrying that extra cost. But yeah, I think that was a tax policy that made us get the education policy wrong.
So I think, well, you're about to get there, but I think just to say it with the foundation formula, the way I'm talking about it, this would be flipped. This would be about allocation, not tax capacity.
Exactly. That's why I'm stressing it now, is that when we're talking about pupil weights in current law, we're talking about tax capacity, how they fit into the tax rate calculation. When we're talking about pupil weights in the foundation formula, we're talking about funding allocation. So it's very different ways of thinking about pupil weights. Someone in this committee, last time I was in here, asked for the pupil weights under current law. So I included this slide. This is what they are. We have our grade level weighting categories, the economically I guess it's deprived background weight, EL weight, the sparsity weight, and the small school enrollment. Weights are additive, meaning that if a student were to fall into multiple categories, those weights would be added together. So for instance, if I were a student and I were in grade 9, I get 0.39. If I was from an economically deprived background, I get 0.39 plus 1.03. If I was an English learner, I get 0.39 plus 1.03 plus 2.49, so on. And then all of those weights would be aggregated at the district level, and that would become the district's weighted student count. So that's current law.
Just to make sure I understand this, looking at 9 through 12, that 0.39 doesn't mean, does it or does it not mean instead of $1.39?
Because these are taxing capacity weights, it's not corresponding with dollars at all. What this is meaning is every student, regardless of circumstances, regardless of category, is a 1. Then you apply the different weights if they fall into some of these. So if you have a student that's K through 5 and doesn't fall into any of the other characteristics, that kid is just 1.
This is recognition that pre-K is theoretically less expensive and high school is more expensive.
That's how to interpret this. The one you've picked up on, the one piece here, the minus 0.54 predates Act 127. So that was the pre-K weight. Technically the pre-K weight was 0.46, but mathematically, it's the same. It wasn't changed. It was just the structure of the statute.
So the 0.339 in that case doesn't mean 39%. It means something very different, right?
Yeah, it means in this instance, it's a child. If they're in grades 9 through 12, they equal a child plus 0.39 of a child, for lack of a better way of putting it in the funding, in the tax rate.
So in a way, it is 1.3.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
1.39.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's not $1.
Yeah. Okay.
39.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
Yeah,
Are you gonna go on to the next slide or?
it's up to the committee.
So, if I can, sparsity weight.
Mhm.
What's the theory behind having an additive factor for sparsity?
Sure.
Just
So
level
all,
set.
so yes, so all of the weights are additive. That's an important distinction because, if weights are multiplicative, then it creates more, those weights have a higher value within the funding formula. So the way that the sparsity weight works and came to be was established in the Colby Baker study as being one of these cost adjustment categories. It's more costly to educate a student in a sparse school. The way that sparsity is calculated is looking at the number of people per square layout mile within the district. Current law says if you're in a district with less than 36 people per square land mile in your district, every student in that district gets an additional weight of 0.15.
I get all that.
Yes,
But why?
policy choice.
Yeah, but can you help us understand the decision? Was it purely transportation?
That was established in the pupil weighting study so essentially the Colby Baker analysis holds constant these different factors and categories and looks for cost adjustments necessary to provide educational opportunities to students. And sparsity was identified as a significantly necessary cost adjustment category.
For why?
Because it's more expensive to educate in rural areas. That's that's,
I mean, we're all trying to like level set so that we can move forward. What's the rationale? Is it purely transportation because you're providing buses?
well, I mean, if you've got an area of, a small population area, you're going to have less taxpayers, but you're still going to have to pay a teacher and staff wages that are relatively similar to what they might be getting in other nearby areas. So,
Yeah, we also have a small school rate, which is. I'm just trying to figure out the distinction between the two and why they existed in current law.
Yeah.
That's all.
well, I mean, I didn't make it. I'm just sharing what my,
Yeah,
I think it's
what
important
I've heard.
that we understand that too, because we're gonna have to deal with it.
Yes, because it's in the new formula too.
yeah, I don't know the why. I would need to go back and review the 2019 report to see if the authors address the why, and I think that they would be better able to speak to it, or policymakers who established 1937.
Representative Kornheiser would be the person to,
Good, look at the report.
But I think it's really interesting that, I mean, the group that came from I don't want them to think I'm trying to twist their words, but the Rural School Community Alliance essentially said, we do things just as efficiently and affordably. So just treat us the same. Don't tell us we have to close because we're small. So I do feel like that speaks to right sizing this particular section so that we're just really thinking about the efficiency costs that are needed to be balanced.
Could be support services
Right.
that, we have to share or get people to
Mhm.
travel to provide those
Mhm.
special needs for students that need them. Because they, even though it's in a sparse area, it's still, we still have students that need those services.
Yeah. But that's why I'd rather use sparsity than small school weighting.
Well, let's look at the report, because it's interesting, because I know what you're thinking, Senator Lee, I mean, I think I do.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, you're saying, why do you have both sparsity and small? Small school would be explained by the fact that you're gonna have grades with 5 kids and you still got a teacher.
Right.
The sparsity is a little bit harder. I'm sure that you asked about transportation being a factor. And I don't know what the others are, but I want to get the report now. What's it called?
I can send it to Will. It's the 2019 pupil weighting factors
Yeah.
report that was,
The
commissioned by AOE
Yeah.
that led to the
Yeah.
task force and then the action 27.
Yeah.
The other piece that I'll mention here, that I think might be helpful level setting, the small school weight is a contingent weight.
Yeah,
So, it's if only for school districts that aren't sparse can a school be eligible for the small school weight. Right, so a non-sparse district cannot receive a small school weight under current law.
so it's saying that because you're sparse, you necessarily have a small school and necessarily it's harder to provide the same level of services if you have the same overhead but fewer students.
Yeah.
I'm willing to accept that. I just think it's worth making sure we understand it better.
Yes.
All right. So that's current law in a nutshell. Maybe more than a nutshell.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can someone sometimes show us a map of the places that are less than 36 people per square mile versus the districts that are less than 36 versus less than 55?
Yeah, I think that, is it BCGI?
Yeah,
GIS?
yeah.
They do all of
They
the
have-
district
they have
sparsity analysis. They're charged with that in statute. So
Maybe it's in that.
I don't know if they have, if they've done it, but that's who I would reach out to.
Yeah.
for it, If I were you.
They did send us that back.
They did?
Well, we had that map that was like, you could do all lots of layers,
Oh, right,
and I was
right,
gonna go see
right.
if this was
Yeah.
one of them.
So moving on from current law to the foundation formula. So you'll recall that the foundation amount in H 454 is passed by the House. That's referred to as the education opportunity payment. So now moving fully away from current law and talking about the foundation formula. So a district's education opportunity payment would be calculated by multiplying the base amount, which would be in statute and adjusted by inflation, by the weighted pupil count. So that means that there's multiple factors and multiple policy decisions that are impacting the education opportunity payment, right? One of them is the base amount, that fixed dollar amount per student, regardless of student circumstances or characteristics. Another is the student count. That's how are we counting kids, right? We count kids right now in long-term membership. And then lastly, which is really what the bulk of this presentation is focusing on, the pupil weights, which determine those adjustments to the base amount or the student count based on circumstances or characteristics. So this is where we're moving from weights impacting taxing capacity, and now we're talking about weights impacting actual dollars going to districts in a foundation formula. That's the question. So in a foundation formula, pupil weights. So this is what I just said, directly impact the amount of funding that a school district receives. So all else equal, the greater the district's weighted pupil count, the more funding it would receive, right? Because the education opportunity payment is the weighted student count times the base amount. Pupil weights are relative to the base funding amount. They represent an additional funding above the base for certain circumstances or categories. So we think about, the base is 10,000. I'm making up round numbers. I'm not saying any recommendations. The base is 10,000. The base is 10,000 and there's a weight of 0.25. You're talking about an additional 25% on top of that 10,000 base. So it'd be the 10,000 plus the 2,500. So when we're considering pupil weights, we also need to be considering them through the lens of what is the base amount that we're talking about, right? Because the pupil weights by themselves are talking about a proportion, but we need to know in proportion to what. These are the pupil weights in H 454 as passed by the House. All of the weights and the base are reflective of the memo that came from Doctors Colby and Baker on April 3rd. So I know this is small, but I know my computer will probably freeze if I blow it up. So because you have it in front of you, it's going to say what we've got here. So this is a base amount of 15,033. So every student, regardless of circumstances and backgrounds, would add 15,033 to their district's education opportunity payment. If a student were to be from an economically disadvantaged background, then they would be receiving the 15,033 plus the 15,033 times 1.02, which would be 15,334. So those dollars would be used to calculate the education opportunity payment. So essentially what we're doing is we're adding up all of the kids plus all of the weights and multiplying that by the base amount to get the education opportunity payment.
Plus special education.
Yes. So H 454, I appreciate that caveat. So H 454 also includes special education weights and the repeal of the census block grant. Perhaps wrongly, but in my mind, when I was putting slides together, I was thinking about special ed as sort of like a separate bucket. So here we're talking about, to your point, not the special education weights that are included in H 454.
Or should we look? Is there, so special ed and CTE and pre-K are not in this bill?
So special ed is included in the bill. It's not
Okay.
included in the slide deck that I put together.
Oh, okay. And then CTE and pre-K are not in the bill.
CTE and pre-K, and this is where I would defer to Beth and John,
Yeah,
Wedge Council as the drafters. There are reports to
okay.
and to come back to the General Assembly and address those next year.
I'm just trying to think about, I just need to make sure I understand how those get left alone when everything else changes.
Right.
I love when there's a question, no answer. Okay,
I think that it's you'll laugh. It's a policy choice, right? It's how you want to address things, what you want to address, what should be included in the bill, what is being saved for next year to work on.
mhm.
We hear that all the time from this same game.
I know that's why, yeah.
Is it going to be hard, like, I don't know that we've heard from like the business managers lately, but is it going to be hard for them to? Well, I guess this, we would get the report back before it takes effect. Is that the idea?
For
Yes.
pre-K
Okay.
or for CTE.
For all of them?
Okay, so the foundation formula
Yeah,
is the effective dates. I don't know, have Beth or John showed you the timeline? Okay,
we have it printed
somewhere. Okay, but essentially
the.
the idea of it is that as passed by the House, the foundation formula would kick in July 1, 2029, as long as the new school districts were operational. So the idea being all of the financing changes are going to happen at the same time that the governance changes are operational. That's at the earliest July 1, 2029, because it's a contingent effective date. The CTE and pre-K report are due, I think, this December,
So,
or maybe it's January, but it's due within the coming months.
so the answer to your question, I think, Senator, is that the reports, we will have those reports before the session starts next year.
Right, and before any,
Yes.
whatever year we set, before any formula would take effect. Okay. Can I just make sure I understand one more thing? The if someone asked me how the tax capacity weight equation is different than the foundation formula weight equation, I hope I even said that right. The multiplier or the variable in, or the non-variable in the equation is the yield rate versus the per pupil amount. How do you do that? How do you do the equations differently? Is that somewhere in your like notes that you could send?
Let me try to answer you.
Okay.
Tell me if I'm not responding to your question. So,
Thank you for trying. Yeah.
so, they're completely distinct.
Okay.
So it's hard to hold them in our heads at the same time
Okay.
because we're talking about two completely different financing formulas.
Okay.
Current law, we're talking about a system in which pupil weights are used to calculate homestead tax rates.
And so, but at some point they have to be equalized over some
The
denominator.
tax rates,
The tax rates versus the per pupil weights.
because they exist in different financing schemes, they're not directly comparable. So the current law weights
Yeah.
are used, the way that a homestead tax rate is calculated is you take a district's education spending
Mm-hmm.
and you divide it by its weighted pupil count.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives you the per weighted pupil education spending
Mm-hmm.
of that district, right? We do that for every district in the state.
Mm-hmm.
And then we divide that per pupil ed spending, where the weights are sitting in that per weighted pupil education spending.
Mm-hmm.
We divide that by the statewide property yield.
Okay.
And that gives us the homestead property tax rate.
Okay. I guess here's like, if this is what it is, it's what it is. They look like the same numbers in a lot of contexts. But I like this, to me, looks simpler from the layperson perspective because you're taking a weighted amount and applying it to a dollar figure that is consistent,
Mhm.
as opposed to a variable tax rate in different communities. I don't even know how you do that calculation, actually. So would the weight amount be the same between the two? Like, how are we taking what we have now and saying, okay, if we're going to do this based on a per pupil dollar amount, this is the accurate weight amount?
Yeah. So Dr. Colby
Mm-hmm.
and Dr. Baker were contracted when this bill was on the House side
Mm-hmm.
to go back. So they were the authors that led to our current law pupil weights,
Mhm.
right? The weights that were adopted in Act 127. When the House was contemplating the foundation formula, they asked to go under contract with Colby and Baker
Mm-hmm.
to update the pupil weights that the state has in statute to be used in a foundation formula,
Mm-hmm.
which meant that Colby and Baker went back into their models and ran the analysis using updated data to say in FY25, what would the weights be if they were to be applied, not in a tax capacity model, but in a foundation formula?
Mm-hmm.
And this is what came out of their model.
But because they also used new data
Yes.
to make new assumptions, right? Like there's a difference now in the assumptions.
I would say that the underlying assumptions are consistent. The change that has happened is calculating the weights for a foundation formula rather than a tax capacity formula and using updated data.
So the updated data part is the difference, right? Because if they had just taken the Act 127 data that they used to create those weights and said, okay, we're moving it from a tax capacity model to a foundation formula model, we wouldn't have zeros in some of those places. We wouldn't have.
Probably not.
Okay. And are we gonna, what if we said we don't want a zero there? What do we do next?
I think that's a question for you all to decide. If you don't want a zero there, then how do you figure out what to put in that place? Those are all policy choices, right? The House passed version decided to put in all of the weights that were included in the memo. The foundation formula corresponding with the memo is considered a cost factor foundation formula because it uses the cost factor modeling, takes the outputs of cost factor modeling and puts it in to law.
Okay.
By changing the weights or some of the weights,
Yeah.
you're moving away from the empirically derived cost factor formula and making policy choices to change certain weights or change the base to address that.
So if we made a policy choice that's different than what's before us, you have the equation tools, like you have the back end algorithmic tools to plug in the accurate amount to the previous weighting system.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
What if we asked you to put back in like a middle and secondary
if you were to
weight?
If you were to tell us what kind of middle and secondary weight you would want.
So we'd have to come up with the number.
Yes, or the additional dollar amount.
Okay.
There actually isn't a dollar amount. It's the actual spending following reimbursements at the end of the year does show that we're getting about
12%.
And so we're actually working with we're working with numbers to do exactly what you're thinking.
Okay, but with a figure that's based on real spending information. Very interesting.
Yep.
Sorry to, take everyone on this journey with me. I hope.
It's okay. We're trying to get our arms around this.
Yeah.
This is why we're doing this, the level set.
I hate when you can't, like, if we're going to go to a simpler system, I still want to be able to explain it to our constituents. That would be a byproduct. That would be a benefit.
Yeah, so I would say that those are policy choices.
Okay, great. Okay.
We, JFO, nonpartisan, not policymakers. So you look surprised over there. We can't tell you, this weight should be this. I don't have my PhD in education finance.
Yeah. Right.
So we could help you when you have policy goals. But those would be choices that you as policymakers would need to make.
Okay.
The other piece of that I would add is, and I think that this is actually later note, but I think it's relevant here, is that when thinking about adding weights, you're talking all else equal, you're talking about adding dollars to the foundation formula, right? The more that you increase funding for a certain student, the more that you're increasing funding overall. So then the question is, it's like that question of squeezing on the balloon, right? If you add in more weights and you don't change anything else, then you're increasing the funding. Is that the policy? Are you comfortable with that? Right? If you are starting to adjust weights, are you also looking at the base? Are you looking at other weights in the financing formula? Those are all questions if you decide to deviate from an empirically derived foundation formula. from a single researcher. Um,
Are we? Are we going to try and dig into each of the weights that look significantly different now than it did to that question?
That is certainly a legitimate exercise.
Okay,
So we are, yes,
okay,
we'll have something to start that conversation.
great, okay.
Yes,
Well, when you squeeze that balloon, you make it bigger over here, but smaller here. So where are we gonna take it?
Well, that still depends though. It's not an equal, it's not like a Pareto efficient equation. It's not a zero sum equation. Because if you just happen to add a lot for poverty and a little for high school, it doesn't mean that it adds up to 100%, but it doesn't mean that someone's getting less because someone gets more. Everyone is sort of in their own box, right?
I guess I would say, if you're adding more for everyone,
Mm-hmm.
then you're increasing the cost.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question is, increasing the cost from whom? And all else equal, that's an increase in property taxes. So that's a policy choice.
yeah, and if we're trying to hold this preview it, the goal is to hold us to this year's 1.88 plus the multiplier before we get to the
1.88.
billion that we're spending this year.
Oh, yeah, a zero for
Yeah.
zero.
And then
Yeah.
that will multiplier, but so by the time it hits it.
Right.
1.8 times the multiplier times the multiplier, because we do 2 years.
So,
But
yeah,
we'll
so
put it back, everything down from that.
in that context, the sum we're trying to get to is the 1.88, which if you added a high school weight, you would be looking at reducing a different weight
Something.
to keep it at
Or
1.88
or the base.
for the base.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the discussion.
Okay.
So
Okay. Couple more slides here. Oh yeah, I included this because, so this is, the same regions. We're still looking at H454 passed by the House. And what I did here is I showed this original table that we already looked at, which is by region, the pupil count and the percentage of the state's pupil count. And then I applied all of the weights in H454 and shows what is the weighted pupil count of that region and what is the state share of the weighted pupil count. So interestingly, you can see, for instance, in H454, Addison has 4.9% of the state's student body, right? It's in it just in like literal children's bodies. Whereas once you apply the weights, they decrease, they have 4.3% of the state's weighted pupil count.
they have 1,200 more students.
Yes,
Everyone gets more.
You know,
everyone gets more because everyone is getting those pupil weights.
Right.
But what we're seeing here, for instance, is Western Chittenden, right? They have 12.7% of the state's student body, but would have 13.4% of the state's
Gonna go
weighted student.
Eastern Chip,
Sorry?
Eastern Chip.
no, Western- no.
Right.
Yeah,
They
and-
choose, yes.
And then Eastern Chittenden,
They have less poverty. Yeah.
So I.
Right, exactly.
exactly, yeah, so I picked Western Chittenden
Yeah.
because Addison is decreasing.
Mm-hmm. And then like Windsor stays exactly the same thing.
I did put in the decimal point because when I was rounding it, you couldn't see as much variance, and I think this is a
Right.
really helpful representation of how weights
Mhm.
can shift
Mm-hmm.
the amount of funding.
Right.
Save.
But so districts that operate a high school are already at a disadvantage in this system. They'd be getting less money than they're used to now, while they are the ones operating the high school.
Based on page 4.
Yes.
Yes.
And I would also just flag, I know that this is me being a bit of a broken record, but under current law, the weights are not determining the amount of funding that school districts are receiving, right? They're determining the tax capacity. So this is looking at, right, here, we're looking at the amount of funding. Under current law, we're not talking about funding.
Right. But yeah, I mean, they're not gaining anything in weighting for having high school students, which is it results in, even if you just redid that, it would be interesting to compare what changes, because that seems like one that creates a big, we're talking about a lot of students, like.
Yes, and that's why I led off with these tables. Because here you can see the state share of
Who has high school students.
of who has high school students. So when thinking about these different weighting categories, and when thinking about the number of students, we can see by looking at these tables that squeezing on the balloon, so to speak, if you were to add a grade level weight,
Right.
for high school students,
Yeah.
you could see that some districts,
That have high
they're
school.
they're pretty uniform, right?
Right.
They've got Addison, across all grades, that's pretty much 5%, bless you, of the state student body, in each grade. Whereas, like we spoke about, Bennington
Right.
has 8% of the state's secondary student body and 6% of K through 8. So
The interesting thing is this doesn't align to district. These are county.
these are regions.
Yeah, these are region, right? So they don't even really tell you
They're not,
exactly who
they're not used for educational purposes, but yeah,
So many numbers.
they're just totally a box.
Yeah, right. But it's like, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to, because I mean, in Chittenden, I'll just use Big County. I know the best. These don't, they are each their own districts. There's no Western Chittenden and Eastern Chittenden. That's 5 to 6 different districts.
Yeah.
And that gets back to the same piece here, that the district boundaries that we're talking about matter. The slide that we went through last week.
Can I ask a random question? I'm not trying to take us down a rabbit hole, but because some people, as I understand it, they send their kids to another, like something that wouldn't fall into these categories, let's say for high school. So they is there any calculation that we need to make to think about where someone goes to high school that's not captured in these regions?
So what is being captured here, long-term membership, is talking about the students within a sending district.
Okay, so they still are counted. They're just counted as if they exist in that
If they're
district.
publicly funded,
Okay,
tuitioned or not.
Yeah.
They are, the sending district is responsible for them, and they
Yeah.
are captured
Okay.
here.
so even if they're like a special ed student who goes to Massachusetts, that they are physically captured as whatever county they're from.
This is my last slide. Hopefully we've talked about all of this, but in case we haven't, I put a few bullets that I was thinking about when I was making the slides, that pupil weights are inherently linked with the base amount, right? They represent that additional funding for certain categories in proportion to the base. So they need to be thought of together. Pupil weights directly impact the amount of funding, both at the state and at the local levels. That's what we were talking about. If you were to add a weight, but not change anything else, we're increasing the funding. If you were to decrease a weight or remove one, you'd be decreasing the funding if you wanted to change anything else. And really that any change to a weight or a weighting category results in a change in funding. And I included a link to the memo in case that was helpful. And that's everything. I don't have questions.
And you were gonna send it, you were gonna send Will
Yeah,
Nobody stumped you. You only said that's policy issue once or twice.
So if I'm correct about this, which is to me the problem with Act 127 versus what we're doing now, then the really interesting thing that will happen once the foundation formula takes effect is that just lower spending districts that have a higher proportion of weighted students or kids, et cetera, who might have had the tax capacity before, but weren't using that full tax capacity, they're going to have a lot more money to work with than they did before. I mean, that's the education policy we never got to with Act 127. We didn't see a huge, we just saw people get whacked on their tax bill, but it's not like, in my mind, we saw those schools that had more tax capacity all of a sudden like have the money in hand to support those students better. And that's a huge difference that we'd be making now.
This is gonna be a big difference.
Yeah.
But remember, the lower spending districts did so because a lot of them couldn't pass their budgets too.
Well, that's what I mean,
Right.
exactly, like, they weren't taking advantage of any tax capacity gain
Right.
because their community was suspicious of
Right.
using more tax capacity potentially, so those low spending districts, it's not gonna be a question anymore of how much appetite for change does your community have.
And they're excited.
I think that's the education policy that I thought we were doing last biennium that we failed to do. Or two, some of you weren't here, but I feel like I was part of that failure.
It was just you and me here.
Well,
Were you here for that?
I was Irish.
Because it wasn't last biennium, it was the biennium
It was
before,
20.
and you were here
20.
in this summer. That's right.
Yeah, I don't think it was, doesn't matter. For this academic discussion. I don't think it was maybe a failure. It improved the system that wasn't great. It made
Right,
not great a little bit better.
right. Well, and
Which is at least something.
I'm gonna get the terminology confused, but I saw it as choosing between tax and capacity or a block grant.
Which wasn't on the table.
Yeah, and it just,
We were very happy.
exactly, we didn't have a foundation formula.
Yeah.
Yeah. Neat.
That was really helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Just out of curiosity, are we able to look before we vote? So we know who we'll be hearing from and why? Are we able to see district by district the impact this will have? Or is that too much to ask of you?
Yeah, we could do that modeling.
Okay.
It's a question of under what construct. With the huge caveat that at least H4, I'm talking about H454.
Yes,
not
yeah,
by the house, because there's not another
Absolutely.
post.
Yeah.
We're talking about, I didn't present that on the House side because the idea was that the foundation formula was going in hand with
District changes.
which is why I was doing things at the VSBA region. It was a proxy for
Mhm.
the larger districts. So we could do that. I guess the question is, how helpful would that be,
Mhm.
given the potential? I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't
Move
ask you to do
larger
that.
districts.
I wouldn't ask you to do that based on 454 or larger districts. Just whatever foundation formula we come up with, and not like before we vote, but at some point before we end the session, to know how a foundation formula, regardless of any governance changes, impacts the existing district.
Yeah,
You're talking about existing districts now or
Yes.
Because we have to put the districts together for them.
I mean, I'm
So-
curious before we vote on a foundation formula, knowing that we won't vote on districts at the same time. What that does to the, what that looks like for existing districts. I just think it's important for us to know.
We can do that. I will also say that, that analysis was underpinning what I showed you last week,
Yeah,
where I showed the relative percentage change of
Right.
current law districts in the graph.
yeah, with the 454 foundation formula. So
Yes.
when we have, if we make changes to that formula, I'd love to see the full breakout
Mhm.
of that. Of that.
Yes.
Yeah, so just to preview what we'll see tomorrow, it's another set of
Right.
the VSBA districts. With a modified the high school weights
Mhm.
that reflect the actual spending.
Right, exactly. And you can, hopefully you can appreciate, Terry, that
But that's-
that's just an amalgamation of our existing districts. That's what we're, even if we're talking about different lines, it's the current district spending that's being used to, or the current student amount.
So there's gonna be winners and losers.
It's just
So
breaking the
winners-
data
winners
out
would be happy
differently.
to see it. The ones that may not.
Well, we're seeing winners and losers now, just on
Yeah.
a more aggregated basis, so I just be curious to break it out a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other piece that I would just say from the data and analysis perspective, yes, Senator Weeks that is exactly what I was talking about.
No, I know, I remember looking at that and thinking, I'd really love to know district by district, like an actual chart of all the districts. That's a good, whatever you call it, histogram that amalgamates all the districts, but just what each district would experience. That's it.
Yeah, so we can do that. The final caveat that I'll say, and that I will include with that analysis is that, depending on those district configurations, if there are new district configurations, if you have a district that may be gaining a lot, consolidated with a district that is going to be losing a lot of funding,
Right.
then you're going to be putting together two, so it will be,
Yeah, and that's exactly what I want to think now, like you would hopefully want to do that, not kind of make a super district in one hand and like Addison looks like it's losing a lot in this particular configuration. I just think that's interesting to understand better.
We'll know more tomorrow about what additional. Okay, I think we are done. We can go off.